Good morning. Oh, wow, thanks, Alan. You been to a Southern church or two? Or a Southern Rotary Club? Okay, if you would take your seats, we would appreciate it so we can get our program started this morning. Welcome to day 2 of the Global Forum on the Culture of Innovation. I'm Carol Coletta. I hope your conversations after our reception and dinner last night were as productive as mine were, and those discussions have continued here through breakfast, and I hope you are meeting people who are expanding your view of what your opportunities are. I know I am, and have exchanged a lot of cards and looking to the follow-up. But this morning we open our program with Fred Dust, and I think he couldn't be better suited to this slot on this program. As a partner at IDEO, Fred works with leaders and change agents to unlock the potential of innovation networks in business and government and society. During his tenure there, he has taken Nike executives shopping, helped to guide the realization of a future-focused education center at Stanford, and worked with patients and staff to build innovative service models for the Mayo Clinic and Kaiser Permanente. He's also collaborated with the American Red Cross to redesign the donation experience and TSA to evolve airport security. I don't think that deserves applause yet, Fred. And next time you're going through TSA and you are fuming and tweeting, as I frequently do, you know, you can just send that right to Fred. Fred serves on the advisory board of our co-host, Aspen Institute, and lectures widely on topics that include design methodology, future experience trends, and the potential of business on social innovation. Fred has a degree in art history from Reed and a master's in architecture from UC Berkeley, and I think that makes him, again, especially suited to address this topic of innovation in a broad frame, but also then this narrower lens, Fred, that we're taking on this, generating more ideas per square foot. So I can't wait to hear what Fred has to say. Let's welcome Fred Dust. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks.
And Carol forgot to say, I'm also a lapsed Californian. I moved to New York about a year ago, so I'm going through a lot of emotion this morning, actually kind of coming across the beautiful, beautiful landscape. Thanks for having me. I just want to kind of give you a brief introduction. I've kind of been asked to talk about innovation culture, and most specifically, the way I thought I'd talk about it today is we're known, IDEO, as an innovation company, and we ourselves have had to shift pretty radically the ways we think about innovating over the last 5 years because of changes in the world. So what I thought I'd talk about is disruption that we're seeing in the space of innovation, new ways of getting to new ideas, basically. If any of you know IDEO, I'm not going to talk much about us, but I will say that the premise of most of the work we do is we're typically asked to kind of come in and conceive the blank of the future. If you know exactly what you want, often you're not coming to IDEO. You're often coming to IDEO when you don't know exactly what you want. And we also tend to work mostly with industries that are in a moment of failure or a moment of potential risk where they're being disrupted, which, by the way, is really good for us right now because pretty much everything actually is being massively disrupted. Most of the work that I've been doing over the last kind of 3 or 4 years are things like education, K through 12, to higher ed education. So an interesting thing happened about a year ago. You always know kind of trends by who walks in the office, and we were having someone from higher ed walk in about every 2 weeks to some IDEO office, and we began to say, there's something here. There's something that seems like there's kind of pretty pivotal and potentially wrong in the system if that's happening. I somehow or another have gotten into a world where I actually have advised federal judiciary on the way technology is going to change the legal practices. And by the way, that's not US federal judiciary, but kinda it is like that, which is actually sort of fun because you can say the word tweeting to them and they all freak out. You know, it's like they all fall over. The idea that you could tweet in a courtroom, they just can't even believe. To government, a good deal of my work has been in kind of the large scale innovations infrastructure for government, doing a lot of work with the current administration on that. I put this picture up because about a year and a half ago, I found myself in a situation where I was in Greece having dinner with the then Prime Minister, talking about how we could actually think about innovating democracy. And what was interesting is as I was sitting there, the phone kept ringing, and I kept saying, you should probably answer that. Whoever's calling is probably 10 times more important than I am, 100 times more important than I am. You should answer. He's like, I don't want to take it. And I was like, no, you should take it. And he was like, I don't want to take it. It's Mubarak. And he's basically kind of wanting to complain about Al Jazeera, and I don't want to chat with him about it. And so what was interesting is it was right during Arab Spring. And so the first thing I want to call out here is that what we're seeing now in the world of innovation is that the systems that are allowing big change, real innovation, often are disrupting the systems that we know and love. It actually means that some of the systems that we've relied on are breaking in order to get to kind of new innovations. And so what I thought I'd talk about this morning, really briefly, is just 3 takes on new ways to innovate. And I'm going to tell you, it's a little bit of a lie, because in some cases, there are old ways to innovate with new methods, new cultural means that we can use to actually think about innovation. If you know anything about IDEO, you know that we actually believe that the foundation for all good innovation is real insight about real people, and that you go deep into understanding your consumer, your inhabitant, your citizen, whoever it is, that understanding deeply really kind of matters. One of the things that we don't believe is that the best way to find out about people is not by asking people. We actually believe that if you ask people what they want, if you ask people what the next innovation is, I see someone from Disney nodding, that totally makes sense, then you won't get what they really want. This is my favorite story about it, which is, I read, and this is from the New York Times, so it's got nothing to do with us, but it was really interesting. There was this great story about radio stations and how great radio stations have gotten at surveying their listeners and basically asking, what kind of music do you listen to? And it's because it's been around for about 100 years, surveying in radio. And when you survey people who listen to music at home or in their cars, and you say, hey, if you're alone and you're listening to music, what kind of music do you listen to, just by yourself? And across the board, everybody answers the same type of music, the same genre of music when you ask that question. Anyone want to guess what that is? There's a big hint. Thank you. It's like classical. So everybody says, oh, if I'm alone in the car or if I'm at home, I listen to classical music. Well, guess what? If you're a classical music station, you know that's not true. That's absolutely not true. But at the same time, you can imagine why, if answering a survey and someone asks you the kind of music you listen to alone and you're given the choice of classical, you may answer that. It's a very loaded question as you kind of look at it. And so this story that I loved was about a company that had something you could wear on your hip, and it would listen to the music that you listen to during the day. And what they found out is that mostly people listen to Celine Dion, I think, when they were alone in their cars. So the point is, we don't believe asking is the way of getting innovation. We actually think that sometimes you have to kind of really spend time with your consumer, really understand them. We do a lot of deep observation, and I thought I'd tell you a story. This is from a story from New York that I love, about watching things for longer than just a minute. Not just seeing it, but actually spending time with something. This is a store called Le Petit Puppy, which is in the West Village, and I don't know if anyone knows Le Petit Puppy, but if you go by the store, what's interesting is they have just these amazingly cute little puppies in the store. And so if you walk by, there's always a crowd of people in front of the store who are kind of watching the puppies. And if you walk by and you're just there for a minute, you say, oh, well, I know why there's a crowd here. There's puppies. You know, who doesn't like puppies? That's why they stop. If you stop and you say, I'll watch for about 5 minutes, what you see is there are people who are watching the puppies, and then there are people who are basically trying to pick up the people who are watching puppies, basically. Because if you think about it, you've just looked at a beautiful, cute puppy, and then you look up, and obviously whoever you're going to look at is the love of your life. You know, it's like puppy, you, it's like it's all set up. So it is like the perfect pickup place. So if you watch it for 5 or 10 minutes, you start to see that. You see puppies, people watching puppies, and you see people picking up the people watching puppies. Then, if you watch for about 20 minutes, what you see is that the stores recognize that, and they've actually put seating on the outside of the store. So there's a whole set of people who are watching people, picking up people who are watching people, watching puppies in the window. And so, in fact, when you spend 20 minutes, you start to see that there's this whole ecosystem that's happening there that you wouldn't have gotten if you just walked by and said, oh, puppies in the window, that's why the crowd is. So we believe in spending real time in situation, really understanding why things are happening. So those are old behaviors. I mean, they're old ways of kind of capturing information. What I thought I'd talk to you about is, like, what are some of the new ways that we're finding that you can learn about people right now? And I thought I'd talk about some interesting kind of innovations that we're seeing in learning about people. This is a system called Glassdoor. Does anyone know Glassdoor? Cool. It's a really interesting system. And I would say when I first thought about 2 years ago, I was like, no way this is going to fly. But what it is it's a way for people in companies to self-report about their job, their salary, their experience working at any big company. They vote on their CEOs, and so basically you can see who's the highest rated CEO at any given moment. You see real-time data coming out of companies with people's perspectives about what it's like to work there. It's funny, nobody had kind of heard about it 2 years ago. Now, pretty much everyone I know who's kind of like a generation below me, even in my generation, uses it as a pre-screen when they apply for jobs. It's people self-reporting data out there, and it's a really quick way to learn. There's a similar thing, I think, called Hot Chili or something like that for professors, where basically you can rank your professors on how well they teach and how hot they are as well, and basically from that, choose what kind of teachers you want. So we're seeing a ton of really interesting self-reporting systems that are out there that are actually really interesting for you all as you're thinking about as you gather data. They're all there for you to kind of pull from in public ways. There's other ways of kind of scraping data that become really interesting. This is a really interesting site called Pulse of the Nation that basically scraped Twitter texts or Twitter feed for over a 24-hour period and looked for words that were either happy or sad, and then were able to, at MIT, map the kind of mood of the day in the United States over a 24-hour period. And they saw all the same things, like people were in California were a little bit happier than people on the East Coast, which I can attest to. People were happier often after work than they were going to work. So basically you could start to see the pulse of the way the day is shaped. What's interesting about this is, stop and think about it, this actually has impact if you are thinking about policing, for instance. You can start to see moments when, and in fact, there are cities that are actually already using things like this. I think, is it Memphis? Or it might even be Santa Cruz that's using a thing called, I think it's Blue Hours, where they actually know where to send police at certain moments based on scraping of Twitter traffic and text feeds. So it becomes really powerful data for us. And when you begin to do that, actually, you can start to think about using that data to kind of send insights back out into the world. This is actually a project we did do. It's for Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And it was a great example where we went out in the field very in the beginning with Elizabeth Warren and kind of spent time actually understanding that credit crisis. And one of the things that Elizabeth and the whole team was really focused on at that point was, we are going to be anti-credit. Like, we do not want credit. It has to basically be about savings. What was really interesting is, very quickly as we went on the field, we realized if you go to the American people and say, hey, we're anti-credit, they just tune you out, because credit is money in the United States. And so we kind of fed a bunch of insights back to Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. They saw themselves in the mirror. They began to realize that they themselves were their consumer. And so the work that we're doing now is thinking about how to take that same data and put it out to the American public so you can see the data about the United States, and from that see insights and learn insights to kind of find out who's like you and actually who's kind of having the same kind of credit behaviors you do. 2. I think this is actually really interesting for this group, which is I think some of the most interesting social public change that's happening right now are what we would consider social entrepreneurs or social actors. And one of the things that we do at IDEO is we have a venture in residence. And by the way, this is what a venture in residence looks like. I took a picture of this guy yesterday. It's just this guy sitting here, and he's actually working. He has one other partner, and they're taking one of our rooms, and they're working with us for a year as they build this thing called Bonzi. Bonzi, by the way, is it's a conscious consumption, collaborative consumption tool that allows you to kind of trade your couch for a week of services, like cooking dinner, things like that. So it becomes kind of a transaction tool. What's interesting for us is by having them in our space, we learn a lot about collaborative consumption and what's happening in that space, but we also learn a lot about venturing and actually the kind of behaviors that we see that happen around speed and how you kind of get things to market really quickly. And what we're seeing over time is this really interesting spread. If you know, kind of, we talk about I people who are deep in one kind of set of knowledge. We really have always kind of valued T people who have a deep skill set, like architecture or something, but are broadly interested in a range of things. What we're seeing with this agile actor group, these kind of venture groups, is that they're X-shaped or asterisk-shaped. They often have 3 or 4 depths that they're playing across and bringing those to the table at different moments. And it feels like there's a different kind of moment with different kinds of people coming forward. And embracing that venture world and bringing it into your world can be a really interesting place to find innovation. It also means that you can prototype in field in ways that we never have. And this is just an example of one guy who, using existing technology, built a really interesting prototype. He's a doctor, this guy named Jay Parkinson, and basically, he at some point said, I don't want to practice like my parents practiced, and he put his calendar online. It was a Google Calendar. You could make your appointment online, prepay using PayPal, and he would do house calls. Within about kind of 6 weeks, he had, I think, 400, mostly Brooklyn moms. He's a really attractive guy, so he had a picture of himself on the site. But anyway, he had a lot of, he's not dumb, a lot of people out there coming to him. Within 6 months, he had venture funding to build a thing called Hello Health, and then within a year, he was considered one of Fast Company's 10 most innovative practitioners in medical care. He did it by putting a very simple prototype into field with just a few pieces of technology. So it's a great example that now we're able to prototype and test in ways we never were able to do before. This is actually one of our people we work with is friends of the Highline, who actually kind of manage and run the Highline. And I would say they act more like a creative startup than they act like a traditional kind of park conservancy. In fact, if anyone saw this last year, they basically decided to build a lab space kind of underneath the Highline where they tried a whole bunch of different social engagement techniques. They're like, let's put a roller skating rink underneath it. Let's put a beer stand. Let's put these things. And they could quickly test what was working and wasn't working and then bring it back. And if you've been to the Highline, it's, I think, the 3rd, it may even be the 2nd, most visited site in New York right now, which is problematic for them because they always meant it to be for New Yorkers. But it frankly is the new Central Park in the sense that it's establishing the neighborhood around it. It's basically building a whole new center to New York from this thing. And they're doing it in a highly experimental, highly in-field way. I think it's really interesting to watch. And we also see it in the social space. People who are taking on big national problems and using venture thinking to do it. This is a group called Venture for America, and their belief is, in the same way with Teach for America, that if we took graduates right out of school, had them go into failing economies and build startups for 2 years, we'd start to jumpstart those economies. So their first year happened, they had 40 people, who are 40 fellows, and they're in 10 cities, I think, basically starting up economies using kind of venture techniques. So they're kind of thinking about job provision and job creation and kind of building economy, but doing it with a venture mindset. Last thing I thought I'd talk about that I think is kind of interesting for all of us to think about, and it's what I kind of alluded to in the beginning, is that our systems are shifting. The ways we can innovate are kind of are radically different than the way we could now. And I think perhaps one of my favorite examples of that is Kickstarter. I'm sure all of you know Kickstarter. It's a way for us to kind of basically, for someone to put a product or an offering or something out there and have people basically invest and either get the product or get a piece of the investment, depending on how much. This is the pretty famous story where I think this got like mega overinvested like in a really short period of time. But I mean, just to tell you how this works, you can do it with a product you want, but in my neighborhood, there's a guy who has a blog about Tribeca, and he does it for dinners he wants to go to that he wants to review to put up on his blog. And so basically he's like, I need $300 so I can take my friend to dinner, and instantly he gets people to kind of kick in with a Kickstarter campaign, and he gets to have dinner and then report back out. So people are using it in all these different ways. In the social space, there's things like Space Hive that does the same thing with public programming. So basically, you can put up a community center, and I don't have the full site, but take a look at it. Actually, this community center totally made its funding within kind of a couple weeks, basically. So people were able to do the same kinds of behaviors with products, but to do it with big public projects as well. And so I think there's a really interesting direct-to-consumer moment that's happening around public projects. talk a little bit about something that we do, which is called Open IDEO. Same thing, which is that we're increasingly putting challenges out, and the idea is not to solve a simple problem or an algorithm problem, but to solve more complex societal problems. How do you get kids to eat better? How might cities, we just did one on cities, and kind of how might you kind of build growth into cities, and basically put it out for the public to participate in. And what we're doing that's a little different than just a prize program is we put it out, and then we get asked just for insights. So people send us insights. Then we actually synthesize it and say, here's 10 really interesting insights. Now people send in design thinking. So people send in design thoughts and concepts. And then we say, here are the 3 most interesting ones. Now people send in thoughts about how to build it. And what's interesting is people just want to participate. They want to engage and kind of want to design. And we've gotten tremendous amount of open source ideas around really interesting things. One of the things, and we were just talking about this just before we came up here, is there are other groups now that are doing similar kinds of things. One of the things I'm most interested in is Bloomberg's Mayor's Challenge, which I don't know if people know in this room, but really interesting. We kind of began work with them a while ago on this. They've been working with a lot collaboratively on how to design a challenge out to mayors, but not just say, hey, give us your best idea, but then once they have the best idea, they're bringing their mayors in, and they're going to work with the mayors to basically, and the mayor's staff, to make them more innovative so they can actually get the idea into field. Not just, we're going to give you money for the idea, but we're also going to give you the support and kind of coach you through it. So there's a whole process to getting the prize, not just the prize itself. So a really interesting open system that's out there. And the last one, and then we'll open it up for conversation, are just incredibly open systems for change. Ways that people are putting things out and asking for a public participation in change that are immediate and actionable. And the example, this is Carrot Mob, which many of you might know. It's a way to kind of force businesses to kind of think about sustainability, which is really interesting in a crowdsourced way. My favorite example is an experiment that happened a while ago in Mumbai around traffic. And basically, at some point, the traffic police in Mumbai, and if you've ever been to Mumbai, it can take literally 4 hours to get across the city. Like if you're in a taxi with someone, you've had the most emotional, it's like you've laughed and cried, and it's like at the end, it's just like this amazing experience. They realized at some point that actually they couldn't possibly police all the traffic issues that were coming forward. And so what they did is they built a public Facebook page that allowed you, if you were in a traffic situation, to take a picture of the person who violated the whatever traffic law it was, along with their license plate, send it to them on the Facebook page, and they would issue a ticket directly. So who doesn't want to do this, right? I mean, come on. It's like we would all do this if we could. But I think it's a great example of putting that problem out to the public and letting them kind of engage in a most direct way. And I think often now, these kind of like public systems are actually solving problems at the same time that they're discovering how to kind of think about them. So I thought I'd put these questions out for you for the day as we are kind of talking, and then I'm going to sit down with Carol and just open it up to questions from Carol or the crowd. Cool.
Okay, well, let's see. Is this on? Yes, it is. Thank you, Fred. And I want to just jump right to this sub-theme of this meeting. If you were in the position of, if you were given the brief or the goal of generate more ideas per square foot, I want you to address how you would begin to tackle that challenge, both as an employer or someone working on behalf of an employer, as well as someone in the public realm, a mayor and so forth, but thinking about, again, public space, the public realm.
Yeah. So I think there's actually a couple things that I would call out. And one of the things, and we actually did this when we did Ventures for America, because they're going to be going out and doing these startups, but they're also going to be working in kind of public space as well. So the idea is that they're supposed to be focused on cities. And we actually spent a really short kind of boot camp period basically getting them good at looking out at the world again. So I think the first thing to kind of recognize around ideas is you have to get really good at paying attention to the environment that you're in. And so I'll just ask you a question. Like, you all came over on the shuttle this morning, or maybe some of you drove. So just for the people who are on the shuttle, how many people spent the time looking out the window versus looking at their iPhone? Good, one person. You didn't. It's like, so a couple people. One of the things that I think is really interesting, that I think is kind of interesting if you think about generating more ideas, is how much time now we spend not paying attention to the environments we're in. And in fact, it's only by paying really close attention to the environments that we're in can we actually get ideas. And so a question I would have for all you, or anyone who's a public innovator, is when you're out in public, in the space that you're supposed to be innovating, tune out all your work and focus entirely on the environment. So I guess the first thing is just look. I think we've stopped looking, frankly, and I think that's made us kind of poor innovators. So I think that's one thing. I actually do think there's really interesting, and it's hit or miss. I think some of these public forums are pretty fascinating. Many of you have probably heard about the Yelp effect, where basically if you if you go to Yelp and you look at any restaurant, everything's kind of like 3.5 stars. And the reason why is because, somebody's like, I love this place, it's the best place I've ever been to, my brother-in-law runs it, and someone else is like, I hate this place, it's a brunch place, and I don't like brunch. And so it's like, at some point, it kind of gets to this weird middle zone, where things aren't right. One of the things I think we still have to get better at with kind of publicly asking questions is, what are the questions we're asking? What are the kinds of information we want? And that's one of the reasons why we're playing with this with IDEO, Open IDEO, is we're not just asking people to sort of send ideas. We're saying first, send observations. Just what are you seeing first, then move to ideas, so that basically you're kind of getting the right kind of information at the right time. So I would say public platforms are really interesting if used in the right way. And then you all as scouts, innovation scouts, and thinking about kind of constantly keeping your eyes open for ideas.
Where would you go to observe, though, the production of more ideas per square foot? Or what are the elements that you have to work with beyond observation? So now I've observed, I see what people are doing, but I want to get them producing more ideas per square foot. Yeah. What do I do?
Well, so that's one of the things that I think is really interesting for you all, depending on kind of where you're coming from, is that I think there's a really interesting moment, recognizing that there's this tremendous kind of entrepreneurial activity, that there are people who are basically wanting to kind of start up and do socially beneficial things. I would say Friends of the High Line is a great example of it. I think one of the things that you could do is take those ideas and better write what I call design briefs. Basically, better ask the social question you want solved. So if you're trying to drive engagement in a certain neighborhood, basically, could you ask that and actually ask it of an entrepreneur group or a startup group? Could you begin to do public experiments? What I loved about the Highline story is that they just did it. They took the space and they kind of began to try things really quickly, as opposed to trying to get it through kind of like a broad spectrum of kind of like, do we like this? Does a city like this? They basically, and granted, they have a lot of forgiveness because they've made such a successful kind of startup around this. But I do think, what's the minimum you can try that actually might be interesting? I'm also interested in looking at really interesting, successful public spaces that you might not think of as public spaces. I think we've talked about this before, where I think the Apple Store is one of the most interesting, successful public spaces that exists right now. And it's not a public space. But if you go and see how it's used like the best city parks, in a day. So there's also kind of who out there is innovating in really interesting ways, and what might you, in a public sector, or if you're in a city space, steal from private sector, borrow from private sector. Yeah.
Let's go to the private sector question. My business success depends on producing more ideas per square foot. What elements do I have to work with? What can I do in terms of space, in terms of the organization of that space, in terms of programming? What are the elements I have to work with?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. If you're a business, or if you're in public sector or social sector, your best asset obviously is your people, and figuring out how to wake up your people to kind of think innovatively. And I think part of it is actually this question of thinking of all of your people as scouts, as something. I think there's a lot around permission that needs to happen from the kind of the top that basically says we are looking for new ideas. And then there's just basic things. There's the ways that you organize your teams. One of the things that I see often, and I see this especially now that I've worked more in the government sphere, is there's an idea that's put out, and often there's a person that's attached to that idea, which is actually a really hard thing if you're thinking about innovation, because if you're pushing forward an idea and that idea fails, you simultaneously fail, which actually makes you fairly risk adverse. And so one of the things I think is interesting is to treat people and ideas separately, so that you can basically say an idea can fail without the people around it necessarily failing, which then allows you to take risks in new ways.
I want to invite you to get into this discussion. Do we have questions? And we will ask for questions. Yes. We have a microphone. Let me go here first, up here first, and then we will come back to you. Yeah.
Tim Tosta, San Francisco. One of the things I think is a word that's missing is the nature of the invitation. That is, how is the invitation made and how extensive does it go? Because an invitation is really an offering, and it's got a built-in generosity about it which engages people. The second part is innovation and creativity have intrinsically a class structure about intellect built in, and I think the languaging is self-limiting because of the way we are shooting for something that tells some people don't see themselves that way, that they have nothing to contribute. So I think those two pieces really have to be considered at the same time, because you're going to build a structure that, you know, that really isn't going to go where you want it to.
Can I just, I think that's such a great point, and I think that's actually what I think is one of the hardest things around a lot of the early things we were seeing around kind of open innovation platforms, or people asking for ideas, is that basically what you were getting, the invitation was, give us your best ideas. So that's not a very helpful invitation if you think about it, because it's basically just saying, give us everything. And not surprisingly, you get everything. Some of it's good, some of it's not good. And so that's to the point around saying, can we get better at asking more tight questions that are inviting people to ask, to kind of really think more deeply? One of the things we've seen in the government in Washington right now is that actually a lot of people who had open innovation platforms that were about, hey, piece of federal agency, give us good ideas, got ideas that were really great ideas from a consumer perspective, but were incredibly hard to implement. Like they actually, implementation would be virtually impossible. And so that's a great example, I think, of the question, the invitation not being rightly formed, potentially.
Yeah, good.
Hi. Shelley Hamilton, CEO of Marin Space, the San Francisco Bay Area. I work in the social enterprise arena, and scale is one of those big words, and I was hoping you could address the last one here. If you've seen ways of tools or platforms or processes or ways of scaling that doesn't require growth, because often what's invested in are growing a company bigger and bigger, and yet you lose the adaptability and the flexibility, the entrepreneurialism of small, agile businesses. Have you seen examples of ways for a solution to scale, but at the small level where they're networked together?
So it's funny, because this is I just did a similar type of presentation actually in Greece that was looking around work around innovation, and one of the things that I was actually kind of posing there is, in fact, one of the questions I have around scaling is that if we lead with the question around scaling, we often don't get to good. And so I think, and so one of the things I actually am really interested in is, do we have something good first? And I think often the ways that you pilot that are actually small experiments and then scaling. That's where I think some of these open platforms become really interesting. It's why I'm interested in what happens with the Bloomberg Mayor's Prize, because the idea is not just to give a bunch of people prizes, it's also to basically say, here then is how you did, here's how this group did it, now you go do it. So basically then it gives people the tools to do that. So I think that there's something there, rather than, and I would believe that now through kind of the technology as a medium, we have the potential to scale without growing, scale ideas without necessarily growing our businesses in good ways, so that we can still do what we do well, but get the idea to spread kind of more effectively. It's a hypothesis, at least.
Hello there, Alan Asagira, visiting from London. Great presentation, by the way. I have a question, especially given the range of work that you do. I think there's a real need for social to have its own vocabulary, and there's way too much borrowing from business. Any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I have a kind of I have another spin on that, which is that I actually think there's a real need for social business, government, public sector to have a more common vocabulary in general. Actually, I think that one of the big issues, and I think I see it when you think about cross-sectoral collaboration or places where cities working with private sector, is that languages hold each other up. And I'll give you a really interesting example. I'm an architect by training. I spent about 4 years after leaving graduate architecture school unlearning the language of architects. The reason why is that I felt like it didn't really talk to the person that we were designing for. It was actually, I mean, my favorite example is, you'd be like, and here we're gonna do a intervention, and then over here there's gonna be, kind of an intersection with the wall, which is just a window, or whatever it is. And so basically, it's like there's this whole way of speaking that like showed your expertise, but then didn't allow people to collaborate around ideas. What I think is really interesting is, can we just get to a more common language around all of the sectoral languages, so that it's not so much about explaining expertise, but more getting to the common ideas. So, a challenge I would have to you all, or even to my people, is just talk normal when you can, and then at least explain when you can't, I think, so.
Mary Corley, Oakland, California, and I was just going to brag that I graduated from the same university as you did, graduate degree from the College of Environmental Design, but I'm still unlearning, okay? My question has to do with...
So am I, by the way.
My question has to do with what I think is pretty, your ITX. One of the core questions is, densifying our innovation. How do you measure, because we measure things, how do you measure productivity, or the productivity of this asterisk type of working where you're collaborating on all sorts of things? I mean, how do you prove to your boss, I mean, or how do these young people who now work for us prove that there is actually some output and it's not just yelping?
I think that's really interesting. And I think, I'll be honest, one of the things, we've had an easy way of getting around that at IDEO, which is that we have a very clear notion of measurement, which is impact in the world, and that's literally, can you see whatever you've been working on in the world in some way? And so, and I think it's actually, it helps us, because it means that we are coming to a place where we basically, at the end of the day, you can say, yeah, but we're not seeing it in the world. And so I think that's an easy one. It's a little harder potentially in your context to think about that, but I think challenging ourselves to think about how we're seeing measurable results, or what are the right measures, is a really interesting question. I don't quite know. I mean, for us, the easy way has been like, is it there? Like, can we see something? Are we seeing some kind of immediate effect, or actually not immediate effect, something there, and then are we learning from it? Because the effect may work or may not work sometimes.
Yeah, that's important. We've got a question back here, and then okay, we'll go there, then here. So someone bring a microphone here. Okay, go ahead.
Greg Shannon from San Diego. I can remember that I have heard everyone say that a successful business is about the people and the labor force ever since I was also told that personal computers would reduce the use of paper and give us free time. And I'm wondering, is that really an opinion or a behavior? Because in my limited experience in San Diego, every company locates where it's most convenient for the CEO, not where it attracts the best talent.
That's actually really, really interesting. And I think, it is a really interesting question. One of the things I've been sort of wondering about recently is that I think, and maybe it's Richard Florida who's been talking about this, which is that challenging whether or not we're as mobile a workforce as we thought we were. There's been this notion that we'll move for the right kind of jobs. And I think increasingly there's a lot of conversations around whether that's actually true. Are people as mobile as possible? I think it's really interesting. And thinking about talent centers and how you kind of create talent centers I think is a really important question. And I do have a question about whether you can create them. And I'd like to believe you can, but even if you look at some of the places where some of the most innovative things are happening right now, they are places you would expect the talent centers to be. There's a reason why I'm in New York right now, because it feels to me that you have just this wealth of kind of collection of talent that are all focusing on these topics. At a moment, however, where you have a mayor that's created a climate that's really focused around that. So you could say regenerated the kind of interest there. I think it's a question. I don't quite know. I think you're right. It's maybe a more hypothesis.
Hi, Fred. Sandra Cully from Los Angeles. Your comment about the Apple Store is one that's always intrigued me. And I was reading Sherry Turkle's book, Alone Together. And at the end of that book, there's a comment with these two kids who are tired of IMing their boyfriend and girlfriend, and they decided to write each other letters. What are you seeing in terms of low tech coming back into community development?
So that's like one of my favorite topics, because what I'm seeing right now is, and this is just me, it's an observation, but is that actually we're seeing a lot of high tech that's actually enabling old school low tech behaviors. And so I'll give you a really basic example. This whole farm to table notion, right? Which is like let's get food from a local farm into a local restaurant. That couldn't happen without email. So what's interesting, actually, is that you have a technology infrastructure that's supporting a really interesting old behavior, one that we actually kind of might like more than the behaviors we currently have. And so what I'm really interested in seeing is how we're seeing technology begin to kind of unpack and taking us back to old behaviors. Bonzi, the venture that I was talking about, the idea that they're looking at a trade economy. So they're basically saying, I got a couch, you're a chef, let's trade, but let's trade services, is like, it's an old behavior. They're using an iPhone app as the mechanism to do it. So I have a lot of hope around that, and I also feel like what we're beginning to see is the reemergence of maybe behaviors that have always been at the core of us as humans kind of coming to the forefront.
Doug Wilson, Laguna Beach. Last comment you made in your talk was about separating ideas from the person, particularly in government organizations where failure is punished. Can you give an example of that? I've never seen that work, and I'd love to hear how that could work, because I've always seen an idea needs an owner.
Yeah.
But if you can figure that out, if there's a way to do that, I'd love to hear.
Yeah, no, I mean, you do need someone to push it forward. I mean, the way that we, right in the beginning of this administration, it's really interesting. We were asked to come in and give our insight into how you would bring innovators into the White House and into government. And our response was really unsatisfactory to the people, which is basically, we said, anywhere you're seeing an innovator, because they were like, help us choose the innovators and we'll bring them in. There's a team around that innovator that's actually making those things happen. So you really want to think about bringing innovation in, bring the person and their team in, not just the person. And so what I would say is yes, but yes, you need somebody who leads it, but you also have to recognize that there's often an incredibly strong team around it that's actually making innovation happen, all attacking a problem potentially from different perspectives. So I guess the answer to your question is, I think teams are the way, because basically if you have a team around an idea, you can put the idea in the center and say, how are we going to make this happen? And a team they can fail, but it's not necessarily like, you're not going to get rid of the whole team necessarily. But it also feels like you have to think about that person and the people around them simultaneously. And I think it's been a flaw, as I've seen it, in terms of thinking about innovators, because I think you think about innovators as a person, you've shut down the opportunity, I think, to do kind of bigger things often.
We have a question right here, and then we have time for maybe 2 more questions. So, okay, and we have one up here. So, people with the mics, do you have one over there? Hang on one second. Do you have a question over here? All right, we have a question here too. Go ahead.
Hi, Mark
I'm just
Huppert.
glad they're questions. I thought it would be like dead silence. So it's like a thing. Anyway.
I'm Mark Huppert with the National Trust for Historic Preservation. My question would be, if a community wants to invest in its creative potential, where does it start?
That's a big question. I think actually it's like I do think, and I think it actually goes. I would connect it maybe to this question around how technologies are enabling old behaviors. Is that actually potentially what we're seeing with technologies is that actually you're getting new ways for communities to kind of refocus on the things that actually matter to them. And again, I think it's like, what are the platforms that might enable it? So they actually might be technology platforms. What are the questions that you ask? One of the things I think is interesting is early on, I think when TED launched its Cities 2.0 thing, I don't know if anyone watched that, I was fascinated to watch how basically pretty much, if you looked at that, the only innovation that people really cared about was a dog park in their neighborhood. Like literally, it was like everyone in the world wanted a dog park closer to them. So it felt like you were actually kind of getting this kind of lowest common denominator. I think there needs to be a bar that's set, and then a kind of request out to the community that's actually there. And then thinking about the tools that you might use to kind of to self-generate around that. What I like about the Highline story is that it's a pretty accidental story, in the sense it was like two guys who met thinking that everybody would want to save the Highline, but nobody actually was taking care of it. So they basically started to bond together and then slowly built that system. I mean, and that was, 15 years ago. It feels like now the ability to kind of build network and infrastructure around ideas you want are pretty significant and interesting. That's why that Space Hive idea, I'm really curious to see how it succeeds, because it's about communities investing in communities, their own communities.
Fred, my name is Jeremy Sharp from Rancho Cerrito in Arizona. Can you speak a little bit more on kind of more the dynamic relationship between public and private and how that's evolving? And during the downturn, we had some projects not work out and kind of split up again. But how is that going to evolve to get projects done and grow more innovation per square foot in that way?
Yeah, I think that, and this actually comes to, one of the things I think it comes back to is language, which is that I think we need to find a common language for the ways that we actually attack our projects, so that we can actually allow for public and private to kind of to integrate in different ways. I think there has to be will and openness, and so it's basically. And this is something that I know that when Bloomberg put together the prize, they really battled with. It's like, because the question was, do we want it to be out of the mayor's administration, or do we want to kind of require that they bring in some outside partner? And I think what they recognized is that actually, and so they didn't require, but I think that their tacit understanding was that for it to be really innovative, it was probably going to need to have an outside partner. So I think there's kind of a recognition that maybe it has to happen, I think. But I would say the language is a big thing, actually. Common mission is really critical, and I think we often forget the value of mission. And I think it's probably because I would blame private sector for this. I think we've reduced the idea of mission and values to the lowest common denominator. There was a great article in Huffington Post that was basically, I guess, there's a Dilbert site where you can self-generate your company mission, and it's like, whatever, it's like, ethics, values, and better bottom dollar, bottom line, whatever. It's like something, and it's like comes up, self-generated. And I think we've actually lost track of what mission is. And this author, Ellen Lubin, if you want to look it up, actually, she says a mission should be a definable action that you want to come out of it. So missions shouldn't be we care about goodwill towards people. It should be, we care about goodwill towards people, and we want to make sure there's art on every corner. Blank. It's like, what's the distinctive thing? And that, I think, we sometimes put aside. And you'll often see these collaborations come together and be like, let's agree we'll never decide on a mission, or so let's just put that aside. That's problematic. Like, I think you should be able to do it. And I think it's like, don't belabor it, but get good at saying, what's the action we're aiming for, and can we all agree on that so we know we're going in the same place? So I think really think about mission. Check out the article in Huffington Post, Nancy Lublin.
Tell us again the author.
It's Nancy Lublin, and I think it's something like how to write a mission statement that doesn't suck. Yeah. I think it's actually literally what it's called.
Okay, do we have one more question? I thought you had. Just stand up and we'll do it without a mic. Go ahead.
I'm Elliot Stein from Palo Alto. We met earlier. Your company, at least in my neck of the woods, because you're based in Palo Alto, enjoys a tremendous reputation as being highly innovative in serving your clients and doing so across an amazingly broad spectrum of clients and needs, designing bicycles, designing services for a bank, all sorts of things. Shopping carts was an example given. What I wanted to know is, when I had a chance to tour your offices, I saw this array of largely very, very young people working there. It was explained to me that they come from a number of different disciplines. You have anthropologists, engineers, people in sociology, architects like yourself. Can you give all of us some advice on your organization's sort of hiring view of the world, and how you pick the people who you think can help you generate these ideas to help your clients?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question, and I think I'll be really honest about IDEA within that context. So the way we hire is, in the end, our biggest limitation, in the sense that actually, if you think about it, I've been with the company for 14 years. We've grown by about 200 people. That feels really big to us. We're like, oh, we've gone from like around 400 to around 600, basically. For most kind of companies, especially working at the scale that we are, that would seem quite small, kind of like not very radical growth. We're incredibly careful about the way we hire. We actually really believe that there's a maximum size that you can be at before it starts to feel like you can't get good collaboration or good understanding. So we think about 40 is kind of the maximum size. And in Palo Alto, what we do is we break into different locations. So basically, what you saw were actually 5 different locations that were within one place. And so it actually means, and it takes a long time, because we screen for cultural fit first, and then we screen for the ideas, then we screen for talent. And so you can get through all 3 of those and then find that someone's not good, and then you have to go back to the drawing board. So it actually takes us quite a while. And I will say it's interesting. By nature, we are a young company. I mean, it's like, I think I'm like really old there. I think I'm one of the oldest people, and it's like, which makes me feel interesting every day. But it's like, but it is, it is funny, and it also means that we're constantly having to learn how the next generation is working, which is, I think, part of the reason why we're thinking about how we innovate our innovation process, because it actually keeps us fresh in the ways that we're thinking about stuff. So there's no secret. I think it's just, except for that we've forced constraints around ourselves so that we can actually be really careful about our hires. I will say one last thing. For some reason, I think it's because of the Nightline video, we're really famous in business schools. Like, I think we're like number 12 most desirable place to work in business if you come out of business school, which is funny considering we're like 600 people. But so if ever I speak in a business school, like literally there's like, everybody swamps me afterwards for like, to get a job. And this guy was talking about interviewing for us, and then also interviewing for another big major consultancy, like way bigger than us. And he was saying that one of the things he was seeing in the interview process is that the other big major consultancy was basically interviewing him and saying, oh, in the end, we want you to leave and go out and be out in the world, running some other big business that will then become a client. Whereas the IDEO people who were interviewing was basically, we don't want you to ever leave. We want you to stay forever, which is actually kind of true. It's sort of the way we go at it. And it was this really interesting truth around the ways we approach kind of the idea of culture being foundational to the way we think about innovation. So,
Fred, on behalf of all of us, thank you.